In the same year, it's followed by Hirai Kazumasa and Kuwata Jiro's Eighth Man. It's a story about dead policeman who was recreated as a robot. And Toei Animation's first TV series, Oof Boy Ken. However, as you can see, the main leads were all men or boys. But in 1966, being influenced by an American family drama, Bewitched, the animation doesn't work. Can I exit slideshow and then can I do the normal view? This animation doesn't work. Normal view. Not presenter's view. The slideshow, but presenter's view. There you go, thank you. Yes, Bewitched. Then the first TV anime for girls, Sally the Witch, was broadcast in 1966. The protagonist is a Western-oriented witch girl, and it was followed by the Secret of Akutan, it's a Japanese girl who can transform herself into anything she wants. Then, since then, it became the magical girl became a popular subgenre in Japanese animation. And then the female leads in the magical girl anime are usually a role model for girl audiences, so that they are often characterized as powerful but cute, well-behaved good girls. However, interestingly, the witch characters also moderately challenged gender norms in each decade. In 1970s, for instance, women's lives drastically changed by higher ratio of receiving higher education, longer working careers, and delay in marriage. Women's liberation movement, called Women's Lib, in Japanese Woman Libu, became intense at that time in order to emancipate women from sexual discrimination at home, school, and workplace. The liberation of women's sexuality was one of the most important issues. In this context, self-made Meg and her sexuality in Meg the Little Witch served as a girl's power to subvert traditional ideas of females as victims of male sexual desire. Although most magical girl anime works were mainly produced by Toei Animation, in 1980s, more animation production companies mushroomed and started to produce magical girl animation. Magical Princess Minky Momo, made by Ashi Production, and Magical Angel Creamy Mami, made by Studio Pierrot, appealed to not only girls, but also boys and adult men. In the 1980s, the second feminist movement in Japan reached its peak, allowing the period of 1980s to be called Women's Age. In 1985, equal gender opportunity law set out, and in 1989, more female politicians gained seats in the House of Representatives. Many women draw public attention in entertainment business, economy, and politics. For example, many female singers, so-called idol singers, such as Matsuda Seiko and Nakamori Akina, gained much popularity. And girls band Princess and girls idol group Onyanko Club brought great excitement to larger young audience. And although it was still a small number, female politicians also drew public attention. The symbolic figure was Doitakaku, this woman, who became the leader of Japan Social Party, the first ever female leader of Japanese major political parties. Because of this appearance and then the movement, this social party created such so-called Madonna whirlwind. Actually, the mass communication, mass media just made up this term and then tried to kind of made fun of them because women's power was really unusual at that point, but it's quite powerful. And then in 1990s, fighting magical girls appeared in the world-famous Sailor Moon series. Sailor Moon is capable of fighting, has boyfriend and a future daughter, and 4 other friends working together. So, Sailor Moon is represented as a have-it-all woman in post-feminist era. In the post-feminist era, the basic law of gender-equal society was enacted in 1999, aiming to construct an ideal society where men and women could be harmonized. The term gender-free, in Japanese also gender-free, was used to discriminate against any bias about gender differences. So gender equality, superficially at least, became realistic. However, it caused collective anxiety in Japanese society in terms of perception of masculinity and femininity. So it led to purge gender-free bashing. Since the 2000s, magical girl protagonists have been characterized as fighting girls, while negotiating between traditional femininity and new gender identity. This is typically represented by the series of Precure that has been serialized for 15 years. Actually, the picture on the right is the first Precure series. I'm sorry about the resolution. The 2 girls fighting together, but they also take care of the little fairies. It's representing like mothering thing. And then the picture on the left is the latest Precure series called Hagutto Precure. It's Hag. And then in this series also, the baby is the very important character, but they are all taking care of her. So those kind of heroines are always negotiating between masculinity, representing the powerful and fighting, and then femininity, like mothering, and 周兵器彼女最下の She the Ultimate Women, the TV series in 2002 exemplified the traits of Sekaikei. One of the characteristics of Sekaikei narratives in this anime is that girls are confronting reality in society, represented by combat with unknown enemies. But boys are staying in their own shell, just waiting. So masculinity cannot be constructed unless boy protagonists possess such girls. While incompetence and powerless of boys are focused in the Sekaikei trend, female solidarity became more focused in the magical girl anime in the 2010s. プエラマギマドカマギカ魔法少女マドカマギカ TV series in 2011 is a very interesting work because it serves to challenge the traditional images of magical girl protagonists in the magical girl anime, and because it has a political function to consider the limit of minimalistic relationships between boy and girl in the Sekaikei narrative. The plot of Madoka Magica is that 5 middle school girls make a contract with a cat-like alien Kyubei to become magical girls. Kyubei gains girls' wishes in return for their soul. So because of their choice, these girls are destined to battle enemies called Majo, witches, eternally until they give up all the hopes. But the loss of hopes turns them into a witch. So it's a never-ending destiny. They never get rid of that destiny. In Puella Magi Madoka Magica, 2 pairs of characters are focused on in terms of female bonds. Kyoko stereotypical in magical girl anime text. However, its notion was challenged by the movie version of this work. The movie Puella Magi Madoka Magica Rebellion, released in 2013, depicts the story after the disappearance of Madoka. Although everyone except Homura died in the TV series, they are all alive in this movie. It turns out that it's a fake world made by Homura's dream, who became a witch. So in order to rescue Homura, Madoka descends from the sky in a human form. But at the very moment, Homura grabs Madoka's arm and violently forces her from divine position. Homura's action serves to question that magical girl or women should sacrifice themselves for someone else. Homura said what drives her is love for Madoka, and Homura accepts that her action is demonic if judged by traditional gender norms. However, her very action questions the typical narratives of magical girls who should make people's dreams and hopes come true. But whose dreams and hopes? That is the question. So, to sum up, in magical girl anime genre, Sekaikei narrative clearly affected the story of Madoka Magica, and female bond or female homosexuality is focused on by excluding males. And then a minimalistic world between you, girl, and me, boy, in Sekaikei anime confronts the limitation. Such a Sekaikei narrative bore alternatives in Magical Girl anime, challenging normative gender images. Then, into 2010s, there are so many varieties in Magical Girl anime genre. For example, Magical Boys. In the late 2010s, the challenging gender representations often appear in Magical Girl anime. As a parody, high school boys become Magical Girl-like combat team for love. In the series of Binan High School Defense Club, Binan Koukou Defense Club Love, they became feminine in their magical transformation. Yep. And then in 2016, in Magical Girl Raising Project, game users can become magical girls. Then one of the magical girls, Rapunzel, it means maiden in French, is a boy. Actually, he was killed in the combat. That boy is a protagonist's childhood boyfriend in real world, but he could transform himself into a magical girl and then become a friend and then fight with his childhood girlfriend together. But once he mentioned that I will protect you, it's like masculine discourse, then get killed after that. Then finally, 魔法少女俺 most recently, 魔法少女俺 I depicts high school girls who made a debut as an idol group. They happen to become magical girls, but in their magical transformation, they turn into macho boys. This also represents gender blurring in magical girl anime genre in the post-Sekaikei anime. So maybe we should watch a lot of alternatives and then try to pick up the sense of changing gender images. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Akiko. We start from starting to get to know what the turn of Sekaikei is. Now it's already post the Sekaikei, so I think today was going really fast forward to know about Sekaikei. Now we welcome Dr. Christopher Howard, which is we kind of programmed this in an interesting way because actually Dr. Howard is trying to theorizing what Sekaikei is, which I think it will have very interesting for the audience from the beginning of the presenters until now. So now the floor is yours, Dr. Howard.
So I think I'm going to divide this talk into three parts. So in the first part, I just want to look at the social and cultural context to Sekaikei. But I think one of the problems with this is it's difficult to decide what exactly is Sekaikei. Is it a genre, or is it a subgenre, or is it a mode, something that goes beyond? Something that goes beyond one particular genre. But still I'm going to try and look at the social context behind these. And actually I think I'll start from this particular work, from Neon Genesis Evangelion. And some of what I'm going to say has already been said in a book, this book, Sekaikei wa Nanika. What is Sekaikei? By Majima Satoshi, right? And actually he divides, look at this in a minute, he divides Sekaikei into different periods. And this work, Neon Genesis Evangelion, from the first period, and he has 3 other periods. And actually, I think a lot of the ones that I'm going to be looking at are from the second period. And I think we've already seen some of these examples in some other talks, right? So this one, Saishu Heiki Kanajo. And this one, Hoshi no Koe. And this one, Iria no Sora UFO no Natsu. So I'm going to be looking at these. Also, I think it's really difficult if you're trying to periodize Sekaikei texts. It's really difficult because there are so many different versions of the text, right? So these dates are really for the animated series. But as most people will probably know, before these animated series, in most cases, there is some kind of manga or some kind of light novel upon which the animated series is actually based. So this causes lots of problems with kind of periodization. And what I want to do is actually, I want to look at some particular themes. I think some things have disappeared. Some particular themes in Sekaikei, which is, the first of these is the theme of social withdrawal or social detachment of the protagonist. And this social withdrawal is not necessarily seen as something negative, right? And the second theme I want to look at is this relationship between the usually male protagonist and the female heroine. And as we kind of know from some of the examples before, this is kind of interesting because the male protagonist is usually the more passive of the 2 characters, right? And the female character is usually the strong fighting character. The male character is the more hesitative, passive character. Okay. In the second part, I want to look at a particular critique of Sekaikei, which comes from the perspective of another Kei, Survive Kei. And I'm going to be looking at one particular account of what is Survive Kei. Maybe as a preview, some examples like Death Note and Liar Game. Maybe people have seen or read these. So I'm going to have a look at this. What is it? How do they critique Sekaikei? And in the third part, I kind of want to look at how kind of universal are the themes of Sekaikei. Is it really, is it just something to do with Japanese manga and anime? Or is it something to do with Japan? Or are these actually themes much more universal? And actually, when I was writing this, I thought about saying a little bit about some other things like Murakami Haruki, right? Because I think if you've read some of Murakami's books, then maybe a lot of these themes of detachment, withdrawal, right? You can kind of also see the slightly weak male protagonist. You can see these kind of things in his work, right? Okay. So I think for most writers writing about Sekaikei, the kind of original Sekaikei text was this one, Neon Genesis Evangelion, right? And the original kind of Sekaikei protagonist, the main protagonist here, Shinji Ikari, right? So this was originally a manga serial which ran in 1994, but became much more famous as a TV anime series which broadcast in 1995-96, right? So I think this takes some elements of, so this one, yeah, Neon, this one. So it takes some elements of kind of the mecha anime genre. This is kind of giant fighting robots, as you can see. Right, but it does some slightly different things in terms of the narrative. And what's kind of really interesting about this particular series is it seems to start in a very predictable way. It's quite a long series, like 24 episodes, I think. And it actually, for a long period, it seems quite a normal TV series, right? So, and Shinji seems like a normal hero, right? So it seems the story seems to develop where he's seemingly following his destiny to become some kind of world savior, using piloting a giant robot to defeat these aliens, the apocalyptic alien threat, these angels. But about halfway through the series, it changes quite radically. And after Shinji, he kind of feels some responsibility for the death or injury of some other pilots. And we gradually see him become more and more withdrawn, right? Withdrawn from further action. And this kind of goes on for a long time, right? Like around about half a dozen episodes. All we do kind of see is him become more and more introspective about what he's kind of done, what responsibility he has. How can he act if he's been responsible for the deaths of other pilots? And actually in this, a lot of the fighting is done by other pilots. Whilst he's busy becoming more and more depressed, a lot of the fighting is done by other pilots. And the most prominent of which is another female pilot, Asuka Langley, which I think is on the left. So she kind of becomes the main character until she also starts suffering from some psychological problems due to her own backstory and relationship with her father. And she becomes more withdrawn from action. So I think eventually Shinji, he finally decides to take some kind of action to save the world, but he still remains very hesitant. I mean, actually what he has to do, his action of killing the final angel, the final alien threat, I mean, I think physically it's quite easy for him to achieve this, that the angel kind of offers himself up to be killed. But still he's very hesitant. What right do I have to kill this angel to save the world, right? So this is kind of how it ends. He actually finally takes some action, but he still seems very kind of hesitant. So I think one of the difficulties is that I think a lot of the most classical Sekaikei texts actually occur after Evangelion, right? And according to Maijima, there are actually 4 different periods of Sekaikei. So the first one would include texts like Evangelion and these 2 novel games. This one, Two Hearts, and this one to the Radiant Season. The original elements of Sekaikei you can kind of find in these. And actually the term Sekaikei develops from fan discourses about these particular anime. So actually, when Evangelion, there isn't a concept of Sekaikei, right? Before Evangelion. It kind of comes afterwards. It develops in response to Evangelion. What is different about this animation from previous animations? Then we move on to second period. It's more self-conscious production of Sekaikei texts. So now there is some idea of what Sekaikei actually is. That it features these slightly withdrawn, slightly passive male protagonists. There is this end-of-the-world threat, right? So this is when this starts to develop. The third period, he argues, is the acknowledgement of Sekaikei in mainstream anime. So like now, kind of everybody who's interested in anime has some idea of what Sekaikei is, right? And at the same time, there are also some generic shifts. So the role of the girl starts to change as people learn the rules, right? And some of the other narrative conventions start to change. And the last period he looks at is, again, he's arguing for some kind of post-Sekaikei culture, right? Whereby Sekaikei actually declines in social relevance. And I'll look at maybe the relation between Sekaikei and society in a minute. And you start getting a variety of critiques of Sekaikei and what is the value of Sekaikei. So I think maybe in the first talk, a little bit, some of this information. So what are the features of Sekaikei? Well, I think maybe in the second period, which I think Maijima seems to think is kind of the most classical period of Sekaikei, you get this, and we've seen some of these already. So you have this kind of, what's often called small love story. in an end-of-the-world narrative. We got the boy withdraws, whereas the girl fights, and descriptions of wider society are vague or absent. And I think in some examples, it's not clear why the aliens are attacking Earth at all, right? No idea why they're there. They're just there, right? So we even lack this kind of information in many cases. So why this theme of withdrawal? Why does this kind of occur in Japan, in Sekaikei? Well, I think there might be some different reasons why people in Japan might want to withdraw from society, right? So I kind of had these. So I think one thing is perhaps to do with some cultural reasons, and the first may be the work culture, right? Which I think people will always hear the kind of stories of people dying from overwork in Japan, right? So there's this this kind of culture of overwork. There is, in many companies, a very rigid hierarchy inside the companies, right? I think women are often marginalized inside Japanese companies, right? And I don't know if in Hong Kong you get the news about the Tokyo Medical University, which, right? So this kind of thing happens, right? I think some people, why might people also want to withdraw? Well, I think it's also a kind of rejection of the social culture in Japan. I think maybe the kind of gender roles are very rigid or more rigid than most places, and I think maybe many of the social conventions are also more structured, right? Things to do with marriage and childbearing are more rigid and more structured. But another thing I had is also kind of, I put political inertia. Why do I got this? Well, I think it's kind of important that Japan is also, or since the mid-1950s, has effectively been a one-party democracy, right? So it's been very difficult to create any kind of real change through an electoral system. And if they do occasionally change the party, this new party is just part of the old party, and then they just come back together again, right? This is kind of what happens, right? So there's been this kind of problem as well. So it looks like any kind of political action is very difficult to actually achieve anything, right? And the last one I had is this idea of the rejection of grand narratives, right? Which I think Hitomi talked about. So thankfully, I don't have to talk too much about it, right? But there's still some interesting things about this, right? I think this has a particular resonance in Japan, right? This idea of the end of grand narratives, and I think this is a problem, right? And why is it has a particular resonance in Japan? I think one thing is because of Japanese imperialism, right? So the imperial project in Japan is also seen as one quite horrible example of a failed grand narrative, right? So this is one reason I think maybe why many Japanese thinkers are very suspicious of any kind of grand narrative like this, right? But I think there are some other reasons as well. I think in Japan also an interesting history of the failure of the radical left, right? So I don't know about how much people in Hong Kong know about the Japanese Red Army, right? But if you know about the Japanese, this is from the film Japanese Red Army, right? The Japanese Red Army in the 1970s increasingly involved in terrorist attacks on civilian targets, right? And most infamously, they also killed many of their own members in a kind of purge of the organization, right? So I think there's a suspicion of any kind of strong left thought in Japan, which is always compared to this Japanese Red Army, associated with terrorism and killing members of your own party, and things like this. And the last one, I think, that often seems to come up in these discussions of grand narratives is the Aum cult, right? And again, I hope people remember the Tokyo subway attack or know about this, right? So this is also associated with the grand religious political project of one particular cult to cleanse to cleanse the world, right? So I think these kind of three things, they often appear in discussions about grand narratives in Japan. Okay. But to some extent, I do think this is a bit of a problem, and maybe for some of the reasons that Sonia suggests, right? Is there's almost no reason to do anything, right? If you have no kind of project, right, then why take any kind of political action at all, right? So is there some kind of way of defending taking some kind of political action without necessarily going back to this kind of behavior, right? Okay. So one thing I wanted to also talk about is the kind of love relationship in Sekaikei. And I think I'm very suspicious about using the word love to describe these relationships because I think they're really based on desire, right? I'm not sure. I don't really think love is the right word. I think desire is more appropriate. And this might kind of seem odd to call it desire because they're kind of filled with cuteness, right? And I think in most of them there's very little physical intimacy, right? No sex, or very little, very little, right? So how can it kind of be about desire and not love, right? So I'm also very suspicious of this concept in Japan, moe. In China, it's meng, right? In Putonghua, it's meng. I don't know right. So I'm also very suspicious about this particular concept as well. And I think there's also lots of stereotypes about desire in Japan, right? Because Japan is so rigid, we have all these ideas that it's full of AV films and hostess bars and lolicon manga and stuff like that. Partly true, right? So maybe these two things are related. So in contrast to something like lolicon, right? These kind of Sekaikei relationships seem very benign, right? So not so much over sexual love in these kind of things. But I still kind of argue that moe is related to desire rather than love, right? And in psychoanalytical terms, what is really going on is the relationship between the masculine subject and its relation to the moe heroine as this objet art. And what is this kind of related to? Well, I think in a lot of psychoanalysis, what they're kind of interested in is because of the entrance of humans into language and other social signifying systems. At the same time, it's impossible for humans to get kind of full animal pleasure. Right? We're always kind of separated from this full animal pleasure. And fantasy scenarios are designed as, I guess, a kind of ultimately futile attempts to somehow find this full animal pleasure, right? And I think a lot of these moe heroines, they also kind of act as this kind of fantasy object. Now, what's kind of interesting about this kind of fantasy object is that actually if you did consummate with the heroine, what would happen is you would be disappointed, right? Because they can actually never satisfy. You can never be satisfied. You can never get to this full animalistic pleasure, right? The object A would just appear somewhere else, right? Maybe you focus on a new fantasy object, right? You can never kind of grasp it. But what I think sometimes happens in these is the relationship is not consummated to kind of avoid this problem of disappointment, right? So I think this is particularly the case for me in Voices of a Distant Star, right? So there's this kind of unbridgeable distance between the heroine and the hero. They will never be together, or they kind of hint possible, but it seems very, very unlikely, right? So they have this kind of love relationship while never actually being able to be together, right? So the hero can never be disappointed because he will never actually get the heroine, right? So I think in Iria it's slightly different. I think this time they are kind of forcibly separated by society in the end, right? So again, they will never actually be together. And the interesting one is I put Saishu Heiki Kanojo, right? Where the ending is actually a little bit ambiguous, but what I kind of think happens is that they both die, right? And they kind of can be together, but then they die, right? So this is how you can, So it seems like your attempt to attain full pleasure actually is impossible, but it results in your death, right? This is kind of the only way you can kind of do it, right? Okay. I had a little bit about part 2. I had this survive style, and what exactly is survive style? And maybe these are the 3 most well-known examples, right? Battle Royale, and Death Note, and Layer Game. Again, lots of different versions of these, so the dates are a little bit ambiguous, right? Okay, and what is actually different about the survive style texts? Well, 1990s and the 2000s in Japan, some social differences which lead to social and economic differences which lead to changes in different modes of text. A change in the 1990s represented by Sekaikei to the 2000s represented by Survive-kei. And what are some of the features of these Survive-kei texts? Well, in this case is characters must fight or die, right? If you know Battle Royale, they have to, literally, the students have to kill each other to be the last one left, or they will be killed, right? In Liar Game, they're in a game show where they have to gamble all of their money, and if they lose, they will be bankrupt, right? And will probably have some terrible, terrible life forever, right? So there's this, you must compete against other people, you must try to take their money, or you will end up with no money yourself, right? So this is kind of the competition in Liar Game. And Death Note, he kind of looks at it from this perspective of the hero of this, Light. He must use the Death Note to kill others. Otherwise, they will come and capture him and send him to prison, maybe be executed or whatever, right? So these are kind of the ideas behind this. You must fight or you must compete. Otherwise, you will die, or you will go bankrupt, or you will put into prison for the rest of your life, right? So in these ones, there is no time or private space for withdrawal, right? Or hesitation or anything like this, right? You can't be like the Sekaikei protagonist, otherwise you'll just quickly be shot, right? And why does he argue that there's this difference? I mean, he actually links it to changes that occurred around in the early 2000s, which was related to changes, well, a few problems in the Japanese economy, but also changes to Japanese labor laws, right? Which actually made it a lot of work increasingly precarious. That is to say, more temporary work, more low-paid temporary work, right? Taking away a lot of the benefits of full-time employment, right? And it's kind of interesting. I think I think in Akiko's talk, she discusses they kind of changed some laws to make it better for women at work. But it's interesting that straight after this, they introduced new laws to make it easier to hire temporary workers, right? So he kind of reads it in this way in relation to these kind of changes, social and economic changes in the 2000s. And he actually complains, why are some people still creating these Sekaikei texts when society has changed? He argues these are the most appropriate kind of texts for the 2000s, not Sekaikei texts any longer, like this. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting that I think you could make almost like some kind of Marxist reading of some of these, but I think he kind of avoids that because I think Uno is also still suspicious of grand narratives, this theme in Japan, suspicion of grand narratives, because he kind of, he looks particularly at Death Note, right? And how, so the hero of Death Note also has his own grand narrative. He sets out with the aim of creating real justice, right? He's seen all this corruption in Japan, the relationship between the gangsters and the police and the politicians, right? This kind of corruption where any kind of real social change is impossible. The gangsters don't go to prison, right? So he sets out to create his own kind of justice. But almost as consequences of this, what happens, consequences, he starts to use the Death Note not for justice, this abstract concept of justice, but just to kind of save himself, basically, right? Stop him from being in court, right? The final part I had, which is going to be really quick now, is how kind of universal is Sekaikei, right? And I looked at kind of some kind of philosophers. So if you read the work of Slavoj Žižek, right, you might see many times when he's arguing for some kind of withdrawal from society. And actually, when he's talking about withdrawal from society, however, I think he's really talking about problems within liberal democratic systems. I guess Japan would still be an example of a liberal democratic system, right? Where he'd argue that liberal democratic systems, in fact, the fact you can vote or whatever, actually they provide no kind of solution to increasing inequality, not much solutions to increasing social violence, and not much of a solution to environmental catastrophe, most of which he just associates with capitalism, right? Out of control capitalism, right? So he would kind of argue from withdrawal from within liberal democratic systems to create some kind of more radical change, right? But I think what's interesting is I think he opposes cynicism, right? Also in general postmodernism, nothing to do with postmodernism he will like, right? And also this idea of play, right? If we have no kind of fixed social positions, we can play at different social positions or whatever like this. Instead, he kind of encourages a return to master signifiers, which I think has, it's this kind of universal political plans, but I think a little bit different from grand narratives, not quite the same as grand narratives. So I think master signifiers will be concepts which can organize people to fight for some particular cause, right? So we can argue whether Occupy Hong Kong had some particular master signifier around which to organize and then protest, or not, or whether this was a problem that it didn't actually have any kind of master signifier, right? So a little bit different from this kind of grand business of grand narrative. He also talks of the right of all humans to the commons. It's not a concept from Zizek, I think, in a lot of work these days. So people should have various rights to things like these should be universal, available to everybody, right? So people should have access to education. They should have environmental security, right? They should have access to shared social spaces. Cities shouldn't be divided between the rich parts and the poor parts. And even says things like, this would be an example of the commons, even non-private ownership of human DNA, right? People trying to patent bits of the human DNA. Okay, so is there a role for love? Actually, I think in terms of a couple, the love of a couple, I think Zizek would still have some quite cynical ideas, right? Because I think you can never really kind of escape from this kind of psychoanalytical logic of desire, right? And the failure of desire to be satisfied. Actually, he talks a lot about, I think, working on kind of Lacan's thought from 1970s, is the kind of difference between the masculine desire and feminine desire, right? Which are just positions. They're not related to physical males, physical females. They're just positions that anybody can actually occupy. And that these kind of two desires will never match, right? The male subject position and the female subject position, if they're together, they can never be, for various reasons, can never be happy, right? They will always fail to satisfy the other's desire, right? So I think he's kind of a little bit cynical about love. But I think love is kind of interesting in relation to some of these kind of political themes. Because I think for some people, love might be a slightly anti-postmodern idea, right? So why is it kind of anti-postmodern? It requires a definitive choice and subsequent commitment. Whereas I think a lot of postmodernism is there is no point to anything, so therefore I can free to do anything. I can take up whatever position I want, don't have to commit to anything, right? So I think there's an idea that love can actually be, in a sense, anti-postmodern, right? And you can find a little bit of this in this kind of book, right? In some of Badiou's work on love, right? So what does he argue? Love is not. So love is not these. Love is not over-planned or over-determined by society, right? So he'd argue that real love is not related to arranged marriages, for example, when there is too much social pressure on the couple. And he argues that it's not based on things like dating company matches, right? People try to plan very carefully who they will be compatible with, right? So he prefers some idea about chance, of a chance encounter, a surprise. You're not really expecting to fall in love, but you do, right? And love is also not something promiscuous, right? Promiscuity kind of lacking commitment, right? So that love actually requires some kind of promise or some kind of commitment over time to somebody else, right? So this one, love requires time. There may be a chance meeting. The chance meeting may be a small moment, an unexpected moment, but actually love requires a long-term commitment, right? And love also requires things like work. People often use the word work. Love is a kind of work, right? It requires patience and compromise, right? So I think the difference between maybe Badiou and Zizek on love is, I think Zizek thinks we can't really get beyond these kind of failed logic of desire, right? Whereas Badiou kind of thinks if you work, then you can, even though male and female will never satisfy each other. If you work, you can still get some kind of mutual relationship, right? And the other thing is that love takes place in the world, right? So while we are working on love, we are also together working in the world, right? So all of the arguments, the incompatibilities, working through these problems will take place in relation to our regular, everyday activities, right? So whatever you're doing, whether it's, I guess, having children would be one of the major ones for most people, right? Or whether you're just paying the bills or whatever, you're kind of working on something. You're working in the world together, right? So this is actually how you gradually form this kind of loving relationship. Maybe not quite like the Sekaikei text, which just seem very instant and very short term. Yeah, so I think this is kind of problem maybe about Sekaikei, right? Okay, I think, can I leave it there? That's okay, right? I can finish.
Okay, we take a short break and then we come back for a discussion. Thank you, Dr. Owen.